Everybody, please welcome to the cult of covering Montclair schools, Mr. Andrew Rice. Andrew, welcome.
Hey, thanks.
We're so grateful for this volunteer effort on your behalf to dig deep into our school crisis. But we got to start with the big question with genuine empathy. Why would you do this to yourself? Are you okay?
So it started off actually as something I got paid to do. So that would be the beginning of the story. About a year ago, I started working on an article about the decline in student achievement nationally for New York Magazine, and I spent months working on that story and talking with experts nationwide about all the contributing factors that have gone into this really dramatic drop that we've seen in standardized test scores that, really scary numbers, in terms of, one third of eighth graders nationally not being able to sort of read on basic texts and so on. So I started trying to figure out what are the contributing factors that are causing this decline. And in the midst of reporting it, I was also as a parent, following the fact that we had a new superintendent. I went to an introductory session where she spoke. I actually participated in some of the forums about having to do with the search even prior to that, and the strategic plan for the district. So, I went to this meeting in July. They just sent a vague email out sort of saying, we'll have an update on our budget situation. So I was there when she announced that, the budget situation was we had no money. And this was a shock. And it was not only a shock to me personally, but it was a kind of like called for some reassessment of the story that I was doing, because while I've been looking nationally at things, I've been kind of ignoring the story at home, or thinking that the story at home was just really something that was personal to me and not necessarily interesting to readers. So I ended up writing about that for New York, writing about, our persistent achievement gaps and all the contributing factors that go into that. So that published in October, November, and then a lot's happened since then. And enough happened that I think sort of the beginning of this year, I thought to myself, I spent all this time researching this both for the story that I did for New York, and just kind of as a as a busybody, sort of trying to delve into these things, creating my own spreadsheets, talking with my friends who happen to also be sort of somehow professionally have some expertise and budget stuff and so on. And I thought, I felt like I'd learned some things and wanted to share them. So I started writing them down. And the Substack is called My Montclair Education. It's basically sort of just my own personal side project.
Yeah. How do you like Substack?
I mean, I hadn't used it before. I mean, I obviously been reading other people's Substacks, so
Right.
this is my first experience with it, and I think it reminds me a lot of of sort of early blogging in the
Yeah.
sense that anybody can kind of hang out a shingle, and the platform is kind of optimized to be idiot proof, and so anyone can kind of create. You can't do much with it. You can't like
Yeah.
make it look all that. You can't either make it look great or make it look terrible, which in a way has a very leveling effect on the platform. And so I found it interesting, and I'm having fun playing with it.
Well, we have lots to get into, including one of your most recent articles, which is titled "Where Did the Money Go?" which is a great title. But first, let's talk a little bit about you. You're from the South, and you worked for papers in Philly and DC. You lived in Uganda as a fellow. And then fast forward, you're now working for New York Magazine and living in Montclair. Was it just a gravitational pull to move here because this is such a media town, or was there something else that brought you
Well, I
to
mean,
Montclair?
to get to the subject of the conversation, I mean, I moved here like so many people, like as the cliche goes, for the schools, and
Yeah.
I moved here from Brooklyn. I mean, my story is exactly the same as
No,
so many
Brooklyn?
What?
people. Moved here from
I've heard of
Brooklyn.
it.
Child was 3 years old. I mean, essentially, just sort of, this was 2014. I guess I was looking around for a house here, but we closed in early 2015. My son went to Montclair Community Pre-K for a couple of years. I happened to live across the street from Bradford, and so luckily enough, we got our placement in the magnet system. Happened to be the school that was across the street from our house. So like for a few years, we just really had a very idyllic kind of suburban situation where my son just walked to school every morning, and it was easy to think that everything was just fine with the school system. But like a lot of people, when I got here, I remember neighbors sort of telling me, the school system isn't really what you might think it is, and me sort of like rolling my eyes and saying, okay, the buildings look fine, it has 3 teachers in his kindergarten class, like how bad can it be? And but really over time, I think some of the shortfalls of the system have become clear. That's not to say there's still great things about the system, and part of the reason why I state very openly in the first of the columns I wrote, like I'm very much in favor of voting yes on this referendum. Part of the reason why, I am is because I think it's important to preserve those things that are good. I think it's also not mutually exclusive to recognize that there are so many ways in which the schools currently do fall short, and that I just don't think that taking money away from them is the answer to
Mhm.
fixing those shortfalls.
You wrote this book a few years ago called The Year That Broke America. And I wanted to bring it up because I couldn't help as I was reading the description and I want to read the full book. I wanted to get your thoughts on, in the process of writing that, and now, of course, writing about Montclair and living here, if there's any connections. And I'll give the quick summary. Basically, that book um, zooms in on Florida in the year 2000. There were so many things going on that year in just that one state. We had the Bush Gore election, we had the Elian Gonzalez saga, we had, did you know this, Donald Trump briefly flirting with a presidential run? I totally forgot that. And then, of course, it was 2000. So we had bin Laden's guys arriving there, connected to 9/11 to take those flight lessons. So your thesis is basically was like in that book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Florida sort of became this petri dish or sort of this foreshadowing of like all of the change that America was about to experience on many levels. And it was a retrospective book, right? 20 years later, you're looking at, all of these signals. And as you're covering Montclair now, it may be a stretch to say this, but I sort of feel like what's happening here is not unique to us, right? We are sort of experiencing all of this turmoil around our school education system, financial turmoil, but also structural and all the things. And I wonder how much of this is we're going to look back and go, oh yeah, Montclair was sort of like in the early days of what now is ricocheting across the country.
I mean, first of all, as we were joking before when we came on, I think that the common thread seems to be them writing about systems in decline, and hopefully someday I'll get around to write. I'll be able to write about systems like on the upswing, but it doesn't seem like that's kind of the macro story of America at the moment. I think the thing that really struck me when I was working on this story about Montclair and then publishing it for a national audience was how much people in other places really responded to what was going on here. I was frankly sort of concerned that when I was writing the piece for New York, that that people would think that we were sort of like an odd, self-absorbed community that didn't really have any kind of anything to say to people elsewhere. But the responses I got, and I've really never in my career gotten responses like this. I get emails from people that were paragraphs and paragraphs long talking about the commonalities between the situation I described here and the commonalities in wherever their community was,
So beyond New York,
beyond New York,
everywhere.
yeah, all over the country. I mean, a lot of them coming from, I think, suburban communities where people had high expectations for public education and were feeling in one way or another that the system was broken, that it wasn't delivering on what it was supposed to deliver to children. And, you don't want to catastrophize the situation and say, that we're sort of uniquely messed up right now because, if you look back, it doesn't seem as if I don't remember public education being sort of a flawless structural system like at the time that I went to public schools in Columbia, South Carolina, which were at the time some of the worst public schools in America. I happened to go to a good one, but the system overall was pretty weak. So you don't want to say that you don't want to kind of overly, feel as if we're sort of uniquely messed up at the moment. But it does seem as if that The data tells us that we're seeing a lot of achievement declines that are real and they need to be addressed. And something structural is going wrong with the system. That's a lot of it is evidenced here in Montclair. I mean, that's first of all, our persistent racial and economic achievement gaps, which are partly driven by declines at the low end. But also, one of the things that's interesting about Montclair is that one reason that the gaps persist and widen is that at the high end, we have a lot of kids who are getting all kinds of supports because they're getting them outside of school, they're getting them through tutors and so on. So you have this kind of divergence between the majority of kids and the kind of like top 10% of kids who are doing better than ever. And that's certainly evidenced in Montclair. And then the third thing that's really evidenced here in a big way is this idea that for all of our spending, and our spending keeps increasing, what we're putting into the system keeps going up and the results keep stagnating or going down. And so the question is, how are we spending our money and what are we spending our money on?
Yeah.
Yeah. We will link to that New York Magazine story in our show notes. Everybody should read that. But I have to ask you, slight non sequitur, but where would the Montclair pod be on the famed New York Magazine matrix? We want to hear it from you.
Oh, certainly highbrow brilliant, like right there on the top.
We were gonna say like mid-brow, mid-brilliant, but
Yeah. I mean, we didn't want to.
but you
I
went
mean,
full
we did an episode on like the crafting resistance. So I think that like, definitely
fried
highbrow.
chicken. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like Pulitzer Prize winning.
I'm comfortable just being right there in the middle of that upper right quadrant. I mean, I don't need to be in the top corner, but definitely want to be in
Sometimes we're
that box.
despicable, and that's okay. You
Yeah.
can't win
Well,
them all, and if everyone's agreeing with you all the time, you're not doing it right. You're not doing it right.
all right, let's continue to talk about your reporting from on Montclair Education at your Substack. One of the most recent pieces is entitled, Where Did the Money Go? One of the central tensions in the article is this divide or debate in town of people who want to focus mainly on fixing the crisis and those who are like, what happened to the money? I'm not giving you another cent until we know exactly what happened with the money. Governor Mikey Sherrill, I think, is more in the latter camp based on what she said on our show when she was on a few months ago, or at least that's how it seemed to us. She asked, how did we get here? She demanded answers before proposing to raise taxes. Why do you think that divide has been so hard to bridge? They seem to be mutually exclusive ideas for some reason.
Well, I think part of the reason is that the district and the superintendent, for good reason, haven't really wanted to focus too much on the question of forensically figuring out what happened. I think because, and I say for good reason, I guess I mean it's understandable why, because A, it's not going to really make people want to vote for the referendum. And I think that I'm intellectually interested in figuring these things out, but as I say in the piece, it's hard to kind of, once you look at some of the patterns of spending and sort of start delving into these questions. I mean, people quite reasonably say, why should we give more to this system that is spending so much money and seemingly has spent it foolishly, or at least accounted for it foolishly? I think we can get into how it was spent in a minute. So superintendent, for good reason, doesn't necessarily really want to go deeply into that. And secondly, it's not really constructive to her purposes, because her purposes are trying to figure out how to get past the crisis. And the question of sort of like dealing with the crisis right now that's happening right now, which is that we need the $17.6 million one way or another. So having a discussion about what happened before doesn't really solve that problem. And I think that's the problem that she's rightly focused on right now. But that doesn't mean that like the people like us, that people who are journalists or people who are accountants or people who are lawyers or people who have public policy experience in the community shouldn't or can't try to figure this out. And so a lot of what I've written about in these Substacks, I tried to construct it. I mean, there's a group called Impact that I'm sure you're familiar with. And I talked with them a good bit. They've been producing these like really, really like substantive, granular reports and white papers about the structural drivers of the deficit and how we got here. I wanted to do something a little bit more journalistic, I guess I'd say, and more about like my own personal attempts to try to unpack this. So a lot of like what I've been writing about are sort of my interactions with other smart Montclair residents, trying to talk with them and puzzle it out and figure out what went on here. So in the second installment that you referred to, the what happened to the money, I have like a whole scene where I just sat down with a friend of mine who works for
Yes.
Fitch Ratings in their public finance department. So basically like does this for a living, and going through the audit report. And we went through the hundreds of pages of the audit report, and at the end, he's like, "I don't really know." Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he's like, "I can't read these reports; they're filled with gobbledygook."
Yeah.
And so, like, if the guy from Fitch like can't figure out what's going on with the district's finances, that says something.
There's a general sense, especially from people who are a little bit removed from the details and the nuance of this situation, to just talk about it in terms of competence. Like, everybody's incompetent. And it's not just about the budget stuff. We've all had situations where we see something going on with the schools, whether it's like a bad teacher being moved from one class or one school to another, or like a decision being made about spending money on something that some people think is stupid. And then a lot of people are just like, these people don't know what they're doing, and there is that temptation to just paint that with a
That
broad
jump to
brush,
conclusion. Yeah.
and I'm wondering, you actually have spent the time to dig into the details, to go through these long reports. What do you say to people who point that finger, I guess?
I mean, I think there's clearly, at best, incompetence, and maybe much worse, that occurred under the previous administration when it came to accounting for finances. In my third installment, which came out Monday, I look at all the sort of human and political factors that contributed to this, and the kind of sort of state of denial that seems to have fallen over at least the administration as to the state of the district's finances, sort of circa around 2023. And basically, that's the point at which this dynamic of pushing bills from one year to the next in order to basically tide themselves over until the next fiscal year started. A lot of people say, "Where's the money? What happened to the $11 million?" And when I sat down with my friend who worked for Fitch, Eric Kim, ultimately, like, what he figured out, or what he concluded from looking at those audit reports, and especially the latest audit report that's from the new auditing firm, that is not the auditing firm that I think we can safely say missed a few things in its previous reports in the districts. So we have a new auditing firm. They came in, and it really reinforced Eric's conclusion that the money isn't missing. We spent it.
Right.
We mostly spent it on people. It's not that surprising of a conclusion. By far, the largest source of expenditures for the district are teacher salaries and benefits for employees. It's not administration. It's not, busing. It's not restorative justice. It's not any of these other things. It's just teachers. And what we spent the money on was school. And there's a good argument to be had about like whether our headcount of staff is too large. And I think that they've already had some layoffs, and clearly they're probably going to have some more in any eventuality. I think that the superintendent has talked about sort of right sizing the
Yeah.
district's headcount. I think ultimately, one of the reasons why it's difficult for the superintendent and the board to talk about what happened in the past is so much of it had to do with good intentions that they had, mandates that they had to fulfill, whether it be for special education, or whether there are moral mandates that they felt to, well, we need to hire counselors because coming out of the pandemic, we had this explosion in mental health challenges. They hired a lot of people to address what seemed like real crises and wanting to do the right thing. And, ultimately it turned out that we couldn't pay for it within the budget that we had. And unfortunately, we're now going to have to lose some things. And really the question is whether we lose a reasonable amount or whether we lose a really catastrophic amount.
Right.
And that's why I'm voting for the referendum, because I don't want to lose a catastrophic amount.
Yeah. And Superintendent Turner has said repeatedly that there's no missing money. And, you just talked about like we spent it all on the schools. Can you dig more into that structural math, though? Because there's the structural math, and people are like, nope, it was corruption. And we'll talk about that in a minute because we have to. But the structural math, right? You're talking teacher salaries, which, of course, with that comes the health benefits, which have skyrocketed. What else is in that structural math?
I mean, it's super boring, right? And
Yeah,
you know, it's really exciting to like go and I looked into it, I've done some investigative reporting in my past and I looked into the business manager and her connections to like the East Orange School District that people talk
right.
about a lot and why do we hire all these people who also happen to be from East Orange and what about the bus contracts and it is pretty shady like some of the bus companies that we contract with and
But yeah,
certainly
your rundown of the bus companies was like, that's a mini series, I feel
I
like, the
mean,
bus companies of New Jersey
I
or
had
something.
no idea until I started looking into this that the bus industry, the New Jersey school bus industry is just there's a grimy underbelly there. It
Who would have
reminds me of
thunk
sort
it?
of like A Most Dangerous Year, that movie with Oscar Isaac, where it was
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
all about
exactly.
the corruption in the fuel oil business in New York. It's like once you get into it, it's like really eye opening. These companies that are driving our kids to school are run by pretty shady folks. So there is like we live in New Jersey. I say this in the piece. Like we think that we're in this progressive island, but the school district is the largest source of government expenditure in our town. And we live in a town that's in a county that's controlled by a democratic machine that runs on patronage and always has, and is one of the most powerful democratic machines in the country. So of course there's like patronage and contracting that you could probably look very closely at, and maybe some people would get in trouble. But ultimately, that's doesn't really separate us from all the districts around us. What separates us from all the districts surrounding us is that we have spent way more,
Mhm.
and we have gotten into a way deeper hole. So what are the drivers of that? So the drivers are, number one, transportation. There's been a big increase in the cost of transportation. So setting aside the question of like whether the bus companies are run by gangsters, they're also costing us a lot of money. All those contracts are run through the county government. So we have limited control over the ability to economize because the county basically does the RFPs
Yeah.
and awards the contracts.
Yeah.
So that accounts for about a couple $1 million last year. I actually quite a bit more, I think, and maybe $4 million. A few
Well,
million
I
here, a
think
few million there. It starts to run together. So that's one of them. Health benefits is, as you mentioned, another. Salaries, just essentially like having to hire more people than we anticipated, largely because we're fulfilling special education mandates, it seems like. And yeah, I mean that really, those are really the big ones. It's people, things, buses, and benefits,
You
insurance.
know, the superintendent has said that our district in the past had an inability to say no, and clearly maybe an inability to let go of teachers when the math wasn't mathing. Enrollment's dropping. We have all these people on staff. And what do you think about that? Like, did you look into that and maybe that's in your latest piece, which is sort of like the political dynamics of what was behind the scenes. Like, why was there such an inability to cut costs where we could?
Well, I think that a couple things happened. Number one of the things that happened is that for a long time we had money. We had extra money.
Yeah.
First of all, in circa around 2014, we had a surplus in our district. There was a big controversy. Everyone was arguing about how to spend the surplus. Basically, what happened is the business manager during the great financial crisis, who, by the way, is Dana Sullivan, who's back now as an interim,
Mhm.
had basically made overly conservative projections in terms of how much things would cost and how much taxes need to be raised. So we raised taxes too much, and district ended up with this huge fund balance. You hear this term fund balance. Basically, they ended up with more money at the end of the year than they had to spend. And over the course of a few years, it built up. And by state law, you're not really supposed to keep that as like just a kitty. So some of it was redistributed to taxpayers by not raising taxes, or I think even some abatements. But then also there was money to hire. Circa around 2014, 2015, hired a bunch of people. Did things like expanding world languages in the elementary schools. Did things like hiring curriculum support teachers for the middle schools to help middle school kids who are struggling in reading and math to catch up. Did things like expanded the special learning communities in the high school, hired some teachers for electives for those special learning communities. If all these things sound familiar, these are all things that are being talked about maybe being cut now. Then fast forward, after that happened, we had a couple of years in which there was both turmoil in the front office among the superintendents. We discovered that the staircase was falling down at the high school, so we did this bond referendum. We had COVID when we discovered that the ventilation systems were completely decrepit, and that was also part of the bond issue. And so money was sort of coming in to address our our sort of facilities needs via that. And the third influx of money came in circa around 2022, which I write about a lot in the Substack, as being the key inflection point year.
Yeah.
We got about $8 million in COVID aid. Our state aid also went up during that period. And suddenly we had more money. Dr. Pons at the time said, well, we're not going to be spending this on recurring expenses. We're going to spend it on things, one-time expenses. We're going to spend it on this and that. But money is fungible. And it seems like basically the fact that we had this federal money coming in, because it coincided with a large hiring increase, you have to conclude that basically the fact that there was money on one side of the budget to do these one-time expenses freed up money elsewhere to do hiring. And by the way, again, back to what I said before, hiring for good things, hiring for like social emotional learning, hiring for redeploying teachers to restorative justice, because there are so many really valid kind of calls from the communities about things like discipline inequities and so on. And then just special education, a lot of special education classifications, recognition, I think, that of the supports that special education kids need. There's a really large increase in the number of special education teachers circa around 2022, 2023 that was meant to sort of address needs that kids had in their IEPs that were not being addressed. And, you add that up and you come to 2023, the next year, Christina Hunt, the newly hired business manager, says we've got a $7.5 million deficit this year. And then what happens after that is that there are giant protests. The high schoolers walked out of class and picketed the BOE, chanting, like, no justice, no peace, screw the BOE. And what happened? And there was a whole movement among local people to redeploy the pilot funding, which is a wonky thing we don't need to get into. But basically, they wanted to take money that they felt the township was hoarding and redeploy it to the schools. Township said, thank you very much. We're going to keep the money. And so basically, there was this budget crisis in 2023 that was relatively small compared to what we're in now, but the dynamics were similar. And what ended up happening is Dr. Pons and Christina Hunt told the board at some point, we solved the problem. We don't have to lay off all these people. And then a couple more budgets went past where they also sort of said, we're doing okay. And then Dr. Pons died and Christina Hunt left under the circumstances she left under. And we know what happened next. We know that we found out that in fact, our fund balance that used to have a surplus was gone, and we couldn't make payroll. Like when I was sitting at that meeting in July, Dana Sullivan said that they had to move money around just to make payroll in June. And basically what happened is that I think for human reasons, these individuals we don't know what Dr. Pons was thinking because he's no longer with us, but it seems like he was working towards a new contract, which he did get, and he was applauded. And a group of parents came to that, came to that board meeting and celebrated the fact that there was stability in the district, and finally we had a superintendent who was sticking around for more than a year and a half, and everybody was really happy about that. And maybe nobody really wanted to check the math too closely.
Wow. So maybe one last question. One of the things that we just spoke recently to Superintendent Ruth Turner in her office, and one of the things that she's focusing on with this forensic audit coming in this summer, hopefully, is to find out in terms of how we spent the money. Was it spent in a way where it was, I don't want to say ethical, but in some ways we have to, like, when we contract for things, right? Whether it's to build a baseball field or rebuild a staircase or whatever it is, there's a process, right? You have to triple bid. Food services is a great example of that. Did the district go through the proper steps of vetting multiple contractors and getting the best quotes before agreeing to a deal where there are kickbacks, things of that nature
I have to
that
say, yeah. I
only
mean,
a forensic audit would know.
yeah. I mean, I don't completely understand how I have to confess. I don't know exactly what a forensic audit will and won't find. My friend Eric Kim at the last school board meeting he's talked about a lot about wanting a forensic audit, but his understanding and his reasons for wanting a forensic audit are different than the reasons that I think a lot of people think that a forensic audit is like Columbo comes in and figures out where the money is.
Yeah.
But in reality, I think what a forensic audit is more along the lines of what you're talking about, which is like a really, kind of like colonoscopy of the district's, spending practices that maybe they'll find out that there's some
Yeah.
criminality going on. But really what it is just sort of like actually figuring out where there are inefficiencies and so on. So Eric is very much in favor of the forensic audit but actually he thinks that the state should pay for it because because he says the state monitor statute suggests that they're supposed to conduct a forensic audit in circumstances like this. Set that aside for a second. I mean, I do think that like clearly, if you start digging into the contracting, you're going to find stuff. And this is true of government contracting anywhere. I mean, some
Yeah.
of it's not that our district is uniquely corrupt or run by particularly nefarious people. This is just like kind of how government contracting, especially in a place like New Jersey, works, where you do have like a patronage machine at the county level and at the state level that does a lot of this sort of stuff. I mean, I think the food services contract, clearly there's something very stinky coming.
And it ain't just the food. Yeah.
I mean, like
This is the former one, by the way, not the new
yeah,
one.
I mean, also, yeah, I mean, I think
Are you talking about because of that Latino superintendents organization where they were on the board of it? You read that whole thing?
I think the totality of the situation, including the fact that there were significant overages, the fact that the food, by all accounts, according to the kids, sucked,
And there
just
was no cap on the overages.
yeah, a little telltale sign that there's something going on there is that the district is suing over it and trying to collect on its insurance bond. So it must feel that there was something rising to the level of something that would merit a legal claim related to it. I'm just judging it. I'm not judging it based on rumors. I'm judging it based on the district's actions, which is that bringing a lawsuit saying that there are unauthorized changes made to that contract seems like a pretty significant step.
Yeah, it just seems like we have these two parallel paths. Like, on the one hand, there is concern that maybe they're not necessarily full on self dealing, but certainly some level of corruption or problematic behavior in the awarding of contracts, perhaps. That things, because of the way politics works in general and patronage, that perhaps the wrong vendors were chosen for certain things. So on the one hand, that could be true, and that's probably true everywhere. On the other hand, there are these systematic budget issues where you are capped at increasing taxes by only 2%, where real costs are going up by more than that every year. And that second situation is more likely responsible for long-term increases in this deficit as opposed to individual things,
Look, I think this is a systemic problem that we have in this district, in this community, maybe just in our democracy at the moment, which is that we are unable to discuss the big things. Sure, it's fun to discuss. I guess it's interesting to discuss what's going on with the food services contract, but the cost overruns there are modest. It's less than $1 million material, right? And we don't want there to be corruption and in the cafeteria business on top of the corruption in the school bus business and so on. But nonetheless, it's not really moving the needle a lot in terms of like what's going on and what's causing our structural problems. And I think to go back to the story that I wrote for New York about educational achievement, I made the observation at the end of that story that we've been talking about so many small things in our district, whether turf at the baseball field. I know that people are really passionate about it, but the baseball field, ultimately it's paid for out of bond funds. The point is like, it's not a big deal in the whole scheme of this, whether a few trees get chopped down or whether we use artificial turf like everybody else or not there. Similarly, the calendar. I could not believe it when, at the school board meeting, the superintendent laid out this really troubling whole list of potential cuts: consolidation of schools, going to like 30 kids per class, potentially at the middle school and high school, lots of layoffs, potential loss of JV sports, and so on, if this referendum fails. And then the first question from a board member was, I'm looking at the calendar and we haven't celebrated Veterans Day in the past. Why are we celebrating Veterans Day in
Yeah.
the next year's
Yeah.
calendar?
But the emails. But the emails. Yeah, this is not just a Montclair thing. You're right. Like, our democracy is, we love to obsess over I don't know, what do you call it? What's that category of stuff? It's just like
The shiny thing,
the, like,
that
the bar chatter, the stuff that's like not moving the needle, but it's
It's easy to talk about those things, right? So the baseball field is
yeah,
like,
it's easy to talk about
it's an
these things, right?
obvious, like, nice thing. It looks
Yeah.
nice. You see it when you're riding on the train, you see the baseball field and you think, gosh, they spent an awful lot of money on that baseball field. But the thing is like, what you don't see are the health benefits. What you don't see are the
Right.
contractually scheduled salary increases for all of our employees that go up every year at a rate that's greater than the rate of inflation, or greater than the cap that we can raise taxes by. So like, it's easy to fixate on these things that are physical, that are seeable, that we know are there, and that are easy to get angry about. Whatever the merits of the baseball field are, pro or con, it's something you can see it. It looks nice, and that's why people fixate on it as an example of waste in the district.
Yeah. But that's the thing that people go nuts about and assume that somebody was getting a kickback to do the $8 million field versus, and it's just, people are quick to look for blatant corruption, or just assume it's there because they don't understand. And I get that, that instinct that
I mean,
people have.
they may be right. There may, but the corruption isn't what is bankrupting our district.
Yeah.
And I think it's it's possible to hold these two ideas in your head at once, which is that there are rotten things in the system that need to be addressed. There are ways in which the schools are falling short and disappointing us, and there are ways in which the system is broken. But the answer isn't to deprive the system of money and to do these sort of draconian cuts that will ultimately only hurt the system by creating an enrollment flight issue that will send the district potentially into a sort of doom loop of endless enrollment declines and cuts in services, which at some point will likely lead to property value declines, and thus to Montclair becoming a less attractive community. So I don't want that to happen, which is why I am voting yes on March 10th, and I hope all your listeners do too.
Well, Andrew, we could talk to you for hours. We really appreciate your time, your insights, your deep reporting. We will link to your New York Magazine article and, of course, your Substack. Thank you so much. We'll see you on the other side of this vote, hopefully. Please don't be a stranger to the podcast.
Well, I'll be happy to come back, hopefully to talk about something more exciting and happy.